Welcome back to Theology Today. In our last episode, we watched as a century of administrative frustration and the fiery winds of the First Great Awakening pushed the progressive American COTUS to do the unthinkable. The Progressive COTUS Assembly unilaterally declared their independence from their European masters in Holland, a bold move that was essentially a direct declaration of ecclesiastical war. For nearly 2 decades in the mid-18th century, a stranger walking into a Dutch Reformed church in New York or New Jersey might have witnessed an astonishing, chaotic sight. Angry rival consistories were locked out of their own sanctuaries, pastors publicly denounced their closest neighbors from the pulpit, and local congregations were fractured into warring camps. This was not a dispute over fundamental Christian doctrine, but a bitter, multi-generational battle for the soul and sovereignty of an immigrant church caught between two worlds. The church found itself heavily torn between the rigid traditions of the old world and the wild, chaotic, and completely decentralized freedom of the new world. Today, in the highly anticipated conclusion of our series, the aggressive counterstrike begins from within the very pews of the deeply divided colonial institution. The progressive assertion of independence catalyzed a bitter denominational split that reflected completely competing and unyielding visions of American ecclesiastical identity across the colonial landscape. The COTUS's unilateral Declaration of Independence in 1754 shattered the fragile institutional veneer of the Dutch Reformed Church in North America, triggering an immediate and aggressive counter-reaction. This bold assertion of local sovereignty deeply offended the conservative ministers and elders who viewed the rejection of European oversight not as a progressive step forward. They viewed this dramatic move as an act of ecclesiastical rebellion and a betrayal of their ordination vows, refusing to compromise with the independent party. The primary architect of the conservative resistance was Dominee Johannes Ritsema, the senior minister of the historic, prominent, and highly influential Dutch Church of New York City. Under his influential leadership, a highly dissatisfied minority of the original COTUS formally seceded from the governing body in the tumultuous historical year of 1755. This breakaway faction organized themselves into a rival assembly known as the Conferencië, establishing a separate power structure to oppose the progressive frontier leaders. The emergence of the Conferencië transformed an internal administrative dispute into an open, highly public schism that fractured families and deeply divided local consistories for years. By establishing a competing governing body, Ritsema and his followers sought to completely delegitimize the COTUS's claims to authority across the expanding middle colonies. They sought to reestablish what they believed was the only valid line of ecclesiastical governance: absolute subordination to the mother church across the Atlantic. The two factions that emerged from the schism represented fundamentally divergent philosophies of ministry, education, and overall cultural alignment within early America. The COTUS party was characterized by immense energy, vibrant piety, and a forward-looking orientation, constantly adapting to the rapid growth of the expanding frontier settlements. While its members continued to profess an abstract reverence for the classis of Amsterdam, they persistently pursued an independent course of action dictated entirely by local necessities. They boldly assumed the authority to examine and ordain young men for immediate service in the expanding American parishes, bypassing the transatlantic bottleneck entirely. Recognizing that a self-sustaining church required an autonomous intellectual foundation, the COTUS party directed its energy toward establishing a domestic institution for higher education. These strenuous efforts culminated in 1766 when they successfully secured a royal charter for Queen's College in New Brunswick, New Jersey, an institution dedicated to training colonial ministers. Conversely, the Conferencië party commanded significant institutional weight and intellectual prestige, counting many of the longest-serving and most highly educated ministers in the colonies among its ranks. In terms of homiletics and pastoral style, the conferency clergy were decidedly less evangelical and revivalist than their counterparts, preferring a formal scholastic methodology over experiential preaching. They took great pride in their direct connection to the academic and ecclesiastical institutions of the Netherlands, emphasizing their strict subordination to the classis at every opportunity. The conservative ministers used their platforms to launch sharp, unsparing criticisms against the Cotus brethren, labeling them as unlearned enthusiasts who were undermining historic standards. Yet the conferency leaders were not blind to the practical need for theological training. Rather, they disagreed fundamentally on the exact mechanism of that education. Instead of founding an independent college like Queen's, Dominic Ritsema devised a strategy to establish a dedicated Dutch divinity professorship within the existing framework of King's College. Although this plan was officially adopted by the college, the chair was never actually occupied, leaving the conferency entirely without a viable domestic educational pipeline. To solidify their operational structure, the conferency formally organized themselves in 1764 into an official assembly explicitly subordinate to the distant mother country of Amsterdam. On a single rare occasion in 1765, they performed an ordination using special permission granted by the mother country, highlighting their complete dependence on transatlantic oversight. The animosity between the Coitus and Conferenti factions lasted from 1754 until structural mediation was introduced in 1771, rendering it one of the most protracted and damaging conflicts in early American religious history. The core question of ordination, who possessed the right to authorize a man to preach the gospel and administer the sacraments, ignited passions that became fearfully embittered. The conflict was not confined to academic debates or floor votes in ecclesiastical assemblies. It spilled directly into the daily lives of local congregations. In many settlements throughout New York and New Jersey, rival consistories claimed ownership of the same church property, causing immense legal and social confusion. Neighboring pastors refused to fellowship with one another, and entire congregations split into warring camps, tearing apart close-knit immigrant communities. The spiritual health of the laity was severely degraded as pulpits became platforms for polemical warfare rather than pastoral edification, leaving the denomination exhausted and structurally compromised. The operational warfare between the two groups was driven by distinct, non-negotiable points of disagreement regarding ecclesiastical structure and oversight. The explicit friction points centered on the training and licensing of upcoming clergy and the execution of proper doctrinal supervision. The Cotus Party insisted that the changing conditions of the American colonies required the local assembly to be elevated to a regular, autonomous classis with full judicatory powers. They maintained that the church had a spiritual obligation to boldly undertake the task of supplying herself with a ministry, utilizing domestic colleges to ensure that pulpits did not remain vacant. This vision was fiercely resisted by the Conferency, who zealously advocated for the preservation of a perpetual state of dependence on the Netherlands. The conservatives argued that the American frontier lacked the theological sophistication, academic rigor, and institutional stability required to maintain doctrinal purity. In their view, severing ties with Amsterdam would be grasped as an open invitation to theological heresy and ecclesiastical chaos, making submission to European oversight a matter of fundamental faithfulness. The protracted paralysis of the schism was finally broken by the strategic intervention of John Henry Livingston, a figure whose unique background positioned him perfectly to bridge the Atlantic chasm. Born in Poughkeepsie, New York, Livingston belonged to a prominent colonial family and graduated from Yale College in the historic year of 1762. Seeking to anchor his theological education in the finest traditions of the Old World without losing his intrinsic understanding of the New, he enrolled in 1766 for graduate studies at the University of Utrecht. During his 5-year tenure in Europe, Livingston systematically utilized his position to dismantle the administrative misunderstandings that had fueled the intense American conflict. He met extensively with leading figures of the Classis of Amsterdam and the Synod of North Holland, acting as an informed, highly capable cultural ambassador for his homeland. He took every available opportunity to articulate the ground-level realities of the colonial churches, explaining that the demand for autonomy was not driven by theological deviance, but by severe logistical necessity. His sophisticated diplomacy earned him the historical title of the Father of the Reformed Church, as he successfully illuminated the colonial context for a European hierarchy that had long operated in an informational vacuum. For decades, the Classis of Amsterdam had misjudged the nature of the American crisis, viewing the conflict through the narrow lens of insubordination and rigid ecclesiastical order. This lack of comprehension initially caused the European judicatory to heavily favor the conservative Conferency faction, reinforcing the bitter institutional gridlock across the Atlantic. However, Livingston's persistent advocacy, combined with the undeniable reality of a rapidly growing self-sufficient colonial society, forced a profound shift in European perspective. The Amsterdam authorities gradually perceived that the administrative flexibility and self-determination seized by the Coatis Party were not symptoms of rebellion, but essential requirements for survival. Recognizing that a refusal to adapt would result in total institutional irrelevance and the complete loss of their constituency, the Classis abandoned its rigid stance and began cooperating to forge an autonomous path forward. Upon earning his doctorate and returning to America in 1770, Livingston assumed a pastoral charge in New York City, immediately leveraging his newfound prestige to orchestrate a peace process. In 1771, under his direct guidance, a comprehensive peace conference was convened, bringing both factions to the negotiating table with a meticulously drafted blueprint for reconciliation, known as the Plan of Union. This document, which had been provisionalized in consultation with European authorities, received formal endorsement from both the Coatis and Conferency parties in 1771. This historic compromise was followed by official binding ratification from the Classis of Amsterdam in 1772, cementing the peace treaty across the Atlantic Ocean. The resolution was achieved with surprising ease, primarily because both parties were profoundly exhausted by nearly 2 decades of localized warfare and structural stagnation. The Plan of Union cleverly balanced the core desires of the progressives with the institutional anxieties of the conservatives, securing complete domestic autonomy over ordination and education. Simultaneously, the honor of the Conservative Party was protected by completely abandoning the old divisive faction names, choosing to move forward under entirely neutral terminology. The ratification of the Plan of Union fundamentally altered the structural architecture of the denomination, transforming it into an indigenous, fully self-governing American institution. The compromise established a 2-tiered domestic governance model, placing a supreme general body at the apex with absolute authority to examine, license, and ordain ministers within North America. Beneath this supreme judicatory, 5 regional special bodies were organized to closely oversee local congregational life, internal discipline, and pastoral relations. By securing the legal and ecclesiastical right to educate and ordain its own clergy on American soil, the denomination threw off its century-long state of administrative pupillage. Acknowledged as independent by its European founders, the Dutch Reformed Church emerged from the shadow of transatlantic subordination, fully equipped to navigate its own destiny. The structural framework established in 1771 provided the immediate stability necessary for the church to survive the massive disruptions of the American Revolution. But it required further refinement to become a permanent legal apparatus, prompting a process of deliberate constitutional maturation with Livingston serving as the primary architect. 2 decades after the initial peace, he drafted and secured the adoption of the first formal constitution of the Reformed Dutch Church in the United States of America in 1792. This constitutional document codified the painful lessons learned from the controversy, permanently organizing the denomination into a balanced system of consistories, classes, and a general synod. Finalized and perfected through subsequent developments in 1793, this constitutional model successfully preserved historic Reformed orthodoxy while cementing a thoroughly American identity that governs to this day. The bitter conflict between the CODIS and conferency parties proves that the struggle for a church's identity is rarely just about administrative paperwork. It forces us to look at how our own structures either feed genuine spiritual growth or suffocate it under the heavy weight of unyielding tradition. When does our loyalty to historical heritage cross the line into a destructive obstacle for the vital future of ministry? Are we truly willing to break away from comfortable, established systems if it means saving the next generation from absolute spiritual irrelevance? Join us next week as we fast forward 2 centuries to investigate another explosive institutional showdown across the landscape. We will dive deep into the battle for biblical authority of the 1970s, unpacking the hidden political and theological maneuvers that radically reshaped modern denominations. We will prove that the intense fight over who holds the keys of governance and absolute truth never truly ended in the history of the faith. If you want to keep exploring the fascinating, messy, and powerful history of the church, make sure to hit that subscribe button for Theology Today right here on YouTube. Don't miss out on our weekly deep dives into the dramatic events and powerful ideas that shape the faith we know today. See you next week.